him from his cab and gave him a friendly nod. The stinker, the louse, Collier thought with hatred. He stuck out his tongue and shook his fist. The engineer not only understood him but managed to convey by a shrug of the shoulders and a nod in the direction of the train. What was I to do? I'd like to know what you'd have done in my place. He's the boss. You're a filthy brute all the same, Collier replied by gestures. The horses were taken, balking, out of the freight cars. The thud of their hoofs on the wooden gangways was followed by the ring of their shoes on the stone platform. They were led, rearing, across the tracks. At the end of the tracks were 2 rows of derelict wooden coaches. The rain had washed them clean of paint, and worms and damp had rotted them from inside, so that now they were reverting to their original kinship with the wood of the forest, which began just beyond the rolling stock, with its lichen, its birches, and the clouds towering above it. At the word of command, the Cossacks mounted their horses and galloped to the clearing. The rebels of the 212th were surrounded. In woods, horsemen always seem taller and more formidable than in an open field. They impressed the infantrymen, although they had rifles in their mud huts. The Cossacks drew their swords. Within the ring formed by the horses, some timber was piled up. Gintz mounted it and addressed the surrounded men. As usual, he spoke of soldierly duty, of the fatherland, and many other lofty subjects. But these ideas found no sympathy among his listeners. There were too many of them. They had suffered a great deal in the war. They were thick-skinned and exhausted. They had long been fed up with the phrases Gintz was giving them. 4 months of wooing by the left and right had corrupted these unsophisticated men, who, moreover, were alienated by the speaker's foreign-sounding name and Baltic accent. Gintz felt that his speech was too long and was annoyed at himself. But he thought that he had to make himself clear to his listeners, who instead of being grateful rewarded him with expressions of indifference or hostile boredom. Gradually losing his temper, he decided to speak straight from the shoulder and to bring up the threats he had so far held in reserve. Heedless of the rising murmurs, he reminded the deserters that revolutionary courts-martial had been set up, and called on him, on pain of death, to disarm and give up their ringleaders. If they refused, he said, they would prove that they were common traitors, and irresponsible swollen-headed rabble. The men had become unused to being talked to in such a tone. Several hundred voices rose in an uproar. Some were low-pitched and almost without anger. All right, pipe down. That's enough. But hate-filled, hysterical trebles predominated. The nerve. Just like in the old days. These officers still treat us like dirt. So we're traitors, are we? And what about you yourself, Excellency? Why bother with him? Obviously he's a German, an infiltrator. Show us your papers, blue blood. And what are you gaping at, pacifiers? They turned to the Cossacks. You've come to restore order, go on, tie us up, have your fun. But the Cossacks, too, liked Gintz's unfortunate speech less and less. They are all swine to him, they muttered. Thinks himself the lord and master. At first singly, and then in ever-growing numbers, they began to sheathe their swords. One after another they got off their horses. When most of them had dismounted, they moved in a disorderly crowd toward the center of the clearing, mixed with the men of the 212th, and fraternized. You must vanish quietly, the worried Cossack officers told Gintz. Your car is at the station, we'll send for it to meet you. Hurry. Gintz went, but he felt that to steal away was beneath his dignity, so he turned quite openly toward the station. He was terribly agitated, but out of pride forced himself to walk calmly and unhurriedly. He was close to the station. At the edge of the woods, within sight of the tracks, he looked back for the first time. Soldiers with rifles had followed him. What do they want? He wondered. He quickened his pace. So did his pursuers. The distance between them remained unchanged. He saw the double wall of derelict coaches, stepped behind them, and ran. The train that had brought the Cossacks had been shunted. The lines were clear. He crossed them at a run and leapt onto the steep platform. At the same moment the soldiers ran out from behind the old coaches. Poverihan and Kolya were shouting and waving to him to get into the station building, where they could save him. But once again the sense of honor bred in him for generations, a city-bred sense of honor, which impelled him to self-sacrifice and was out of place here, barred his way to safety. His heart pounding wildly, he made a supreme effort to control himself. He told himself, "I must shout to them, come to your senses, men, you know I'm not a spy." A really heartfelt word or two will bring him to their senses. In the course of the past months his feeling for a courageous exploit or a heartfelt speech had unconsciously become associated with stages. Speakers are platforms, or just chairs onto which you jump to fling an appeal or ardent call to the crowds. At the very doors of the station, under the station bell, there stood a water butt for use in case of fire. It was tightly covered. Gints jumped up on the lid and addressed the approaching soldiers with an incoherent but gripping speech. His unnatural voice and the insane boldness of his gesture, 2 steps from the door where he could so easily have taken shelter, amazed them and stopped them in their tracks. They lowered their rifles. But Gints, who was standing on the edge of the lid, suddenly pushed it in. One of his legs slipped into the water and the other hung over the edge of the butt. Seeing him sitting clumsily astride the edge of the butt, the soldiers burst into laughter and the one in front shot Gints in the neck. He was dead by the time the others ran up and thrust their bayonets into his body. 11. Mademoiselle called up Kolya and told him to find Dr. Zhivago a good seat in the train to Moscow, threatening him with exposure if he did not. Kolya was as usual conducting another conversation and, judging by the decimal fractions that punctuated his speech, transmitting a message in code over a third instrument. Skov, Pskov, can you hear me? What rebels? What help? What are you talking about, mademoiselle? Ring off, please. Skov, Pskov, 36.015. Oh hell, they've cut me off. Hello, hello, I can't hear. Is that you again, mademoiselle? I've told you, I can't. Ask Poverihan. All lies, fictions. 36. Oh hell. Get off the line, mademoiselle. And mademoiselle was saying, Don't you throw dust in my eyes. Pskov, Pskov, you liar, I can see right through you. Tomorrow you'll put the doctor on the train, and I won't listen to another word from any murdering little Judases. 12. The day Yurii Androvich left, it was sultry. A storm like the one that had broken 2 days earlier was brewing. Near the station, at the outskirts of the town, littered with the shells of sunflower seeds, the clay huts and the geese looked white and frightened under the still menace of the black sky. The grass on the wide field in front of the station and stretching to both sides of it was trampled and entirely covered by a countless multitude who had for weeks been waiting for trains. Old men in coarse grey woolen coats wandered about in the hot sun from group to group in search of news and rumors. Glum 14-year-old boys lay on their elbows twirling peeled twigs, as if they were tending cattle, while their small brothers and sisters scuttled about with flying shirts and pink bottoms. Their legs stretched straight in front of them. Their mothers sat on the ground with babies packed into the tight shapeless bosoms of their brown peasants' coats. All scattered like sheep as soon as the shooting began. They didn't like it, the station master told the doctor unsympathetically as they walked between the rows of bodies lying on the ground in front of the entrance and on the floors inside the station. In a twinkling everybody cleared off the grass. You could see the ground again. We hadn't seen it in 4 months with all this gypsy camp going on. We'd forgotten what it looked like. This is where he lay. It's a strange thing. I've seen all sorts of horror in the war, you'd think I'd be used to anything. But I felt so sorry somehow. It was the senselessness of it. What had he done to them? But then they aren't human beings. They say he was the favorite son. And now to the right, if you please, into my office. There isn't a chance on this train. I'm afraid they'd crush you to death. I'm putting you on a local one. We are making it up now. But not a word about it until you're ready to get on it. They'd tear it apart before it was made up. You change at Sakanichi tonight. 13. When the secret train backed into the station from behind the railway sheds, the whole crowd poured onto the tracks. People rolled down the hills like marbles, scrambled onto the embankment, and, pushing each other, jumped onto the steps and buffers or climbed in through the windows and onto the roofs. The train filled in an instant, while it was still moving, and by the time it stood by the platform, not only was it crammed, but passengers hung all over it, from top to bottom. By a miracle, the doctor managed to get into a platform and from there, still more unaccountably, into the corridor. There he stayed, sitting on his luggage, all the way to Sakanichi. The stormy sky had cleared. In the hot, sunny fields, crickets chirped loudly, muffling the clatter of the train. Those passengers who stood by the windows shaded the rest from the light. Their double and triple shadows streaked across the floor and benches. Indeed, these shadows went beyond the cars. They were crowded out through the opposite windows, and accompanied the moving shadow of the train itself. All around people were shouting, bawling songs, quarreling, and playing cards. Whenever the train stopped, the noise of the besieging crowds outside was added to this turmoil. The roar of the voices was deafening, like a storm at sea, and, as at sea, there would be a sudden lull. In the inexplicable stillness you could hear footsteps hurrying down the platform. The bustle and arguments outside the freight car, isolated words from people, farewells spoken in the distance, and the quiet clucking of hens and rustling of trees in the station garden. Then, like a telegram delivered on the train, or like greetings from Meliotsevo addressed to Yurii Androvich, there drifted in through the windows a familiar fragrance. It came from somewhere to one side and higher than the level of either garden or wild flowers, and it quietly asserted its excellence over everything else. Kept from the windows by the crowd, the doctor could not see the trees. But he imagined them growing somewhere very near, calmly stretching out their heavy branches to the carriage roofs. And their foliage, covered with dust from the passing trains and thick as night, was sprinkled with constellations of small, glittering waxen flowers. This happened time and again throughout the trip. There were roaring crowds at every station. And everywhere the linden trees were in blossom. This ubiquitous fragrance seemed to be preceding the train on its journey north, as if it was some sort of rumor that had reached even the smallest local stations, and which the passengers always found waiting for them on arrival, heard and confirmed by everyone. 14. That night at Sukunichi, a porter who had preserved his pre-war obligingness took the doctor over the unlit tracks to the back of some unscheduled train that had just arrived, and put him in a second-class carriage. Hardly had he unlocked it with the conductor's key and heaved the doctor's luggage inside when the conductor came and tried to throw it out. He was finally appeased by Yurii Androvich and withdrew and vanished without a trace. The mysterious train was a special and went fairly fast, stopping only briefly at stations, and had some kind of armed guard. The carriage was almost empty. Zhivago's compartment was lit by a guttering candle that stood on the small table, its flame wavering in the stream of air from the half-open window. The candle belonged to the only other occupant of the compartment, a fair-haired youth who, judging by the size of his arms and legs, was very tall. His limbs seemed to be attached too loosely at the joints. He had been sprawling nonchalantly in a corner seat by the window, but when Zhivago came in he politely rose and sat up in a more seemly manner. Something that looked like a floor cloth lay under his seat. One corner of it stirred and a flop-eared setter scrambled out. It sniffed Yurii Androvich over and ran up and down the compartment, throwing out its paws as loosely as its lanky master crossed his legs. Soon, at his command, it scrambled back under the seat and resumed its former likeness to a floor rag. It was only then that Yurii Androvich noticed the double-barreled gun in its case, the leather cartridge belt, and the hunter's bag tightly packed with game that hung on a hook in the compartment. The young man had been out shooting. He was extremely talkative, and, smiling amiably, at once engaged the doctor in conversation, looking, as he did so, fixedly at his mouth. He had an unpleasant, high-pitched voice that now and then rose to a tinny falsetto. Another oddity of his speech was that, while he was plainly Russian, he pronounced one vowel, u, in a most outlandish manner, like the French u. To utter even this garbled u, he had to make a great effort, and he pronounced it louder than any other sound, accompanying it each time with a slight squeal. At moments, apparently by concentrating, he